Good morning. Our lesson for peer group number 5 is over perception and self identity, as presented by Heriberto, Kelsey, Farhan, and Guadalupe. Let's get into our lesson. Number 1 is what is perception? Perception is defined as a process of being aware of and understanding how we see the world. They are formed by how we select, organize, interpret, and remember the various bits of information that we come across on a day to day basis. They are also affected by various circumstances, such as number one, selective attention, number two, selective exposure, number three, selective perception, number four, selective memory, number five, organization, and number six, interpretation. Now, in 1960, 152 male and female students from Ohio State University were surveyed over whether or not their perceptions of presidential candidates changed after watching the debates. The findings were that 143 participants held the same opinions after the televised debates as they did before. So, what did this study prove? It's proved that perceptions are not necessarily easily changed or modified once they have been set. Again, don't mind my face. I apologize. It's a video that I recorded within the slides as well. So you can see our example there with our two little guys arguing over, hey, it's four sticks or four things that I see laid out. The other guy says, no, I see three. So that's a perception is based on how we see things and the world. Number two, what are the influences on perception? Well, there's four main influences on perception that we researched, and they are culture, media, field of experience, and language as well. There are multiple ways that each of these influence a person's perception. In the way of culture, it is the way that they are raised and the beliefs and values that they hold from the time they can talk and walk, and for the most part throughout their lives. For media, it's in the mediated way that they show things like beauty, gender roles, family life, and workplace interactions. This is especially true for the younger generations who seems to live their lives vicariously through social media outlets such as Facebook, Instagram, Snapchat, and all the popular ones. Field of experience could influence perception as well because people are made up of individual experience, and it is only natural that those personal experience would color the way that each person views the world. The last influence is language. Now, there's two parts to that. Language, number one, can actually influence perception in two ways. It can do so by the actual verbal language that is used, which allows us to perceive and interpret meanings from other people. Number two, the second way it can influence through the vocal pitch that is used when talking to somebody. For example, a growing amount of literature shows that the pitch or tone of human voice can strongly influence how speakers are perceived. So now we move on to what is self identity. Self identity is how you recognize yourself as an individual in relation to society. This can include your job, hobby, and skills. Your self identity can be affected by gender, sexuality, and culture. One example is bicultural identity, and this is something that I can identify with as well. When you are part of two cultures, it may be difficult to identify yourself in the social settings. For example, you may be more comfortable with one, but if the people surrounding you from one culture only may feel like an outcast, you may feel like an outcast. Many Mexican Americans relate to this because of the barriers they have with language and accents. In other words, being able to speak both languages, but with an accent, then being called out by those who are solely from one culture. I saw this growing up a lot with many of my friends. I was actually pretty blessed to have had a tutor from a young age and never really had an accent. But I did see this growing up with my other friends and my surroundings as well. So, what is social perception? Social perception is how you perceive others. In other words, how you see them as a person. Your social perception on some may be inaccurate or have to change over time. We often make assumptions about others based on looks, attitude, and other characteristics. Now, these assumptions may lead to a false perception of a person. Also, we must keep in mind people change over time, and so does their identity. For example, this happens many times during our lifetime after a big life event. Therefore, it is important to always keep an open mind and use perception checking, sort of like checks and balances with our government. So we also use perception checking. Number one would be question your perception, seek beyond what you see, realize people do change over time. So let's look at our comparisons here. Social identity versus personal identity. Groups that we fall into and associate ourselves with are race, religion, ethnicity, etc. Our in groups are people who are in the same group as us, such as students. And out groups are people who are not in the same group as us, such as our parents. And then personal identity. Personality traits, things that are special to us and make us who we are as individuals, make us distinct from other people. And then there's three cognitive components of social theory that we happen to research as well. They are social categorization, identity links between thoughts and behaviors, happens on a subconscious level. Example, we don't identify as students. Initially, you only know you're supposed to go there and learn. Number two, there's social identification. We begin to adapt to the social norms and identities, quote unquote, the self. Example, as a student, know when to raise your hand, obey rules, and do homework, respect peers. Almost like the unspoken curriculum or the hidden curriculum when we go to school, when we're taught to obey authority, learn to respect others, and know when our turn is. Number three, social comparison. Pattern to recognize intuition, to identify all categories, compare our in group with other groups or other groups with out groups. We look at our in groups more favorably and positively than our out groups. We also tend to exaggerate similarities with our in groups and differentiate with our out groups. And then we leave you with one last thought, which was Max Weber's idea of social perspective, developed with the Bernstein German term empathetic approach to understanding human behavior. Weber believed that the researcher has to imaginatively study the subjects through the first person in order to understand the actions of a people or group being studied. So, in order to understand perspective and the groups of people, one has to take into account empathy as part of the process. Thank you very much, and that is our peer group presentation.